This educational video describes the roles that states play in disaster recovery, including governors and state agency officials. Emphasis is placed on practical, peer-to-peer advice. We focus on the experience of two states, North Carolina following Hurricane Floyd and Mississippi following Hurricane Katrina. While states play a number of important roles in recovery, there's limited guidance to help inform the actions of governors and agency officials that may not have experienced a major disaster. This video will address those potential gaps in knowledge and experience. In the next 30 minutes, we'll discuss the following topics: addressing short-term recovery issues, procuring federal and state funding, establishing a state recovery committee, providing housing assistance, incorporating hazard mitigation into recovery, coordinating the timing of assistance, planning for recovery, and leading disaster recovery efforts. For more information on how to use this video, as well as other relevant materials, see the Role of States in Disaster Recovery Training Guide at coastalresilienccenter.org.
The first thing that people have to understand is we had a plan. The plan had been being developed since Camille in 1969. And when we planned to Camille, we thought we were planning the worst possible disaster. And of course, Katrina was far, far worse, far, far bigger.
I went to houses where people had been flooded. They went up the stairs and up the stairs and into the attic. And finally, they had to cut a hole in the roof so they could come out on the roof and get on a boat. That's how deep the water was.
During any kind of disaster or emergency, I don't care how big or how small, two things are always going to happen. People are going to want to help by donating something to the person who's been affected, or they're going to want to help by volunteering. Processes need to be in place to handle that.
You know, and I know that states, like the federal government, is going to have a legislature that does its thing and responds to the pressure of the people who've been impacted by the disaster. And you're going to have the standard executive agency response. Well, in our case, we knew it took the two together. So what we brought in was a legislative leadership position that was in the legislature, namely the chief of staff or the Senate leader, and put him together with the executive agency folks so that we moved in sort of lockstep. We went so far as to make sure that each step we did, we briefed the minority party on what we were doing, how we were doing it. Because in the end, a disaster of this scale is going to take more than federal resources.
So the relief fund was started, and it was a collaborative effort between the policy office and Governor Hunt's office and the Commission on Volunteerism. And then I got involved with the relief fund because of the Governor's Emergency Information Hotline. So we used that hotline as an avenue for individuals who wanted to donate. They could call the hotline and get information about how to donate to the relief fund.
There's kind of a sequence of things that must take place as you start recovery. The initial stabilizing the population, making sure search and rescue, emergency medical, making sure you have enough commodities, enough sheltering to support the families. And then you start focusing on those most critical buildings and infrastructure to restore.
Look at what your people need. Don't assume that the federal programs are enough. We, at the local level, at the state level, have a responsibility to help the feds help the people.
We took the Disaster Relief Fund donations and provided grant money to nonprofit organizations whose mission is to help recover after disasters. Every state in the country has a statewide group called Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, or VOAD. A lot of them are well known: the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the food banks, Church World Service, every faith denomination there is has a representative. And it's those organizations and the partnership that the governor's office has with those organizations is just an invaluable thing. State government can't do this alone. If it weren't for these voluntary organizations and everything that they do, we would not get through response and recovery for disaster.
The state pulled together significant amounts of data, hardcore data, to document the level of loss, whether it was income loss, agricultural crop loss, housing stock loss, economic loss, tabulated the data and quantified it so that we were able to make the case to Congress based on hardcore data that additional funding was needed, support was needed to help jumpstart long-term recovery.
After Hurricane Katrina, what we saw in many cases were federal programs that served immediate needs but didn't have the long-term staying power to be there when you really started to feel the strain of the disaster. And you know, in our case, we're 10 years into Hurricane Katrina today, and still recovering in many cases and having to recover without the benefit of a lot of those resources.
And so one of the things that we did is we quickly assessed the gap or the difference between the funding that we believed we would have available, what the needs were at the local level, and what the difference in those costs might be.
Unfortunately, lots of the damage was in underinsured or uninsured areas. It was in poor areas, and so you had this huge gap, not a small gap, but a huge gap. And so we started working on what types of resources could we potentially pursue from the federal government. I think ultimately we came up with $750 million of additional federal aid or some figure similar to that. And then you're left with the gap. And how much of the gap are you going to fill with your state appropriation?
And you work your head off to get all you can from Washington. They should respond to these things. And then you say, where's the rest of it coming from? Because you can't let people just sit out there and rot. The governor has to get in there, roll up his sleeves, get out there, see those disasters every day, be able to tell the fresh stories and explain why it's good for the state and critical in helping the people, and then push and not take no for an answer and make damn sure they do what they ought to do.
Do we want to build back quickly what we had before, or do we want to build back better than what we had before? And if you build back better, then you're going to have to figure out supplemental sources of funding.
It just so happened I knew President Bill Clinton, and I knew James Lee Witt, who ran FEMA. And I personally talked to them about the situation, about the need. I went to Washington, I can't tell you how many times.
The governor's office worked extremely hard. His lobbying staff up on the Hill worked very, very hard. All of the leadership of the General Assembly were making phone calls to various members of congressional leadership on an almost daily basis. And it was the culmination of all of that that led to this additional support we got from Congress.
My staff, working with Senator Cochran's office and the other Mississippi delegation people, and with FEMA, for that matter, what comes in the FEMA package, what doesn't come in the FEMA package, let's identify what's not going to be covered, and then let's figure out the best ways to try to get those covered through some special legislation. So we designed the program. We were very much in touch with the White House, and when we learned that the president was going to put out his program somewhere in the second half of October, we made the conscious decision we're going to put ours out after his, because anything in ours that's in his will be easier to get. If the president had it in his plan, we had it in our plan, then that made it easier. Ultimately, we asked for $33-point-something billion for Mississippi over 10 years. We laid out in pretty good detail, here's what it's for. Here's why we're asking for it. To the point that when I presented it to the House Republican Conference, one of the congressmen, a senior member, got up and said, it looks to me like this is conservative and comprehensive.
Following a major disaster, states often have at their disposal a variety of different resources, one of which is potential state appropriations. When governors call a legislative session to try to identify additional funding that can supplement federal aid, as well as the creation of what's often called a governor's relief fund.
I personally invited all the legislators to come to the governor's mansion. We talked about the situation, and this was before we had the legislature was not in session. And we laid out for them what the cost would be to rebuild, to recover and to rebuild.
First of all, at a scale of need, we knew we weren't going to be able to address the $3 or $4 billion shortfall. Unless we did some special tax or whatever, we're not going to generate that type of revenue in a poor state. And then we had the question of politically a tax increase versus other forms of raising revenue to deal with it. One time we had several things that we put on the board, looked at alternatives for raising money. The state budget officer came in and an emphatic governor had us boil down the needs to what we thought were the highest priority, which was under his guidance boiled down to pretty near the hardcore needs.
And they did what I asked them to do. Now, it took a lot of money out of the rainy day fund. You drained that for quite a while. It took money from all of the state agencies. Everybody had to put some up, do without. But it was the right thing to do for the state. We got, as I recall, $800 million or something like that. A pretty big disaster appropriation for that the Redevelopment Commission would administer, because their job was to look over it all. What are the overall needs we have for the state to recover? We're talking about the long-term recovery here, mainly.
When we first got started, we didn't have any kind of recovery office. The Mississippi Emergency Management Agency is an emergency management office. And yes, it's involved in search and rescue and that sort of short-term stuff. It manages the FEMA programs in the state along with FEMA, like debris removal. But by and large, there wasn't an office focused on here's where we ought to go, thinking long-term.
We found early on that you've got a lot of different programs. FEMA has a lot of different programs, but they don't necessarily work together. They aren't necessarily coordinated. You don't necessarily know how much is needed here or there or whatever.
And what happened in the state was we looked for alternative vehicles to do that. What vehicle would give us the fastest, crispest response, complementing the existing system? And I say complementing, very important. If you don't complement the existing system, you end up probably at war with it. That's what we did. That's the redevelopment office.
So we had designed this about 50-member commission and put it together in about 2 weeks. Part of the deal was give people a place to have a voice, to learn what the people down there were thinking. But also, we wanted them to help us identify what wasn't covered and what might be the best ways to cover certain things. The rules from the beginning, the commission is not going to impose anything. The commission's job is to expose people to different ideas of the different ways things can be done, but not to tell the people on the coast they got to do it.
The Governor's Office of Recovery and Renewal was established as a way to help further the actions of the Governor's Commission. And we did three primary things, one of which was to identify funding sources beyond those available under the Stafford Act. We also advised the Governor and his cabinet officials on policy related to long-term recovery. And we worked to build the capacity of local governments to better understand the complexities of recovery and to provide them information about recovery activities.
One of the first key roles of the Governor's Office of Recovery and Renewal was creating a post-disaster long-term recovery policy framework. And so it was allowing essentially a centralized role for the governor and the governor's office to play in coordinating the various forms of resources and assistance that would ultimately be available in the long-term recovery environment. I think that's probably one of the most important roles that the Governor's Office of Recovery played, especially very early on, was making sure that instead of having planning for the sake of planning, that you had planning for the sake of an actionable plan that was workable, manageable, and actually could be realized given the resources and the framework that was available.
One of the things that we learned in Mississippi was it was critically important to, in essence, be relentless, to try to serve as true advocates for the needs that we identified at the local level. We did that in a number of ways. One is to routinely meet with local officials, meet with those impacted by disaster, share the most up-to-date information we had, because that information often changed over time.
People could go there and they could talk and they could listen, but they saw, hey, these people are focused on the future. This isn't about next week. These are people, what's Mississippi going to be like in 5 years, 10 years, 30 years? And it gave people hope and confidence. And without that, we would have never gotten people to come back.
Housing is a critical part of recovery. In many ways, think of it as kind of the hub of a wheel, in that immediate sheltering, short-term housing, and long-term housing has all kinds of implications, including the ability to get people back to work, to get them to rebuild their homes, to get the economy back in order.
I think we're so short-sighted in this country in large-scale disasters. It should be a partnership with FEMA and HUD, particularly for low and moderate income families, that you do an assessment early on, and if they don't have the ability to rebuild their property, or there's not going to be housing available, go ahead and do something like the Mississippi Cottage. Apply your FEMA grant funds to it, plus whatever supplemental HUD funding may be available, and go ahead and get a family in a permanent dwelling. That's what we need to do.
When you look at the Mississippi Alternative Housing Program, you have a program there that was a pilot program that was really very unprecedented in a post-disaster framework. The ability to bring in something other than very temporary housing and instead build housing that could potentially be sustainable and could be reused and redeveloped for the long-term recovery needs. I think there was a concept that was proven there, which is for a relatively small amount of federal investment, the federal government can build more sustainable post-disaster housing, housing that can withstand natural hazards. You know, one of the biggest fears that we had in coastal Mississippi was the potential of another landfalling hurricane when we had 45 to 50,000 of our residents living in temporary travel trailers. And so with that in mind, you really have the potential there for a second disaster to hit a very vulnerable population.
We did these much stronger than typical mobile homes. They would withstand 150-mile-an-hour winds if they were put down on the foundation the right way and could be removed from it.
They were literally a modular home that were bolted to mobile home chassis. And they were done that way so that they could easily be brought into the area and be set up.
2 or 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a living room, kitchen in the front, and about a 6-foot front porch, covered. They let us build 3,000 of them, if I remember, and they were phenomenally better. And I believe if you took a 3-year view, they weren't much more expensive than a mobile home, and they weren't even much more expensive than a travel trailer. I'll never forget the first person moved in one. Lady, 70, French name, coast accent, East Biloxi. She got up, she said she'd lived all her life in this area of East Biloxi, just not a stone's throw away from right now, right here. And then she said, "This is the nicest house I've ever lived in."
And of the roughly 3,000 units that were procured, over 2,000 of them became permanent dwellings. And that's a huge success story.
Hazard mitigation is a key component of the overall disaster management cycle, if you will. Not only can it be used as a way to reduce risk before an event, it also is an important element of good disaster recovery. In North Carolina, following Hurricane Floyd, the state was very aggressive in pursuing hazard mitigation activities, and they did that in several ways. One of which was they were involved in one of the largest single state level buyouts in history, over 5,000 homes acquired and moved to higher ground. But the state also took it upon themselves to use state money to identify funds to create and take ownership, if you will, of the remapping of the state's floodplains.
If Hurricane Katrina struck the Mississippi Gulf Coast today, in 2015, it would be a much different situation. There would be far less homes impacted, far fewer businesses impacted. The infrastructure would be able to withstand a lot of the brunt of Katrina's force, whereas in 2005, that did not happen. And that is as a direct result of the fact that the planning that went into the post-disaster recovery and long-term recovery, and then certainly looking at those hazard mitigation principles, looking at those sort of best practices of sustainability and building things stronger than they were prior to the original disaster, such that you're not going to have a replay of those events in the situation that you had another similar disaster hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
I think to be truly responsible and to be able to be responsive, state government and local governments, but in particular the state, because it has that statewide view, really needs to be diligent about monitoring mitigation and monitoring preparedness and engaging very proactively in mitigation strategies.
So one of the programs that we developed was the State Acquisition Relocation Fund. We realized that under the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the federal rules require that these funds can be used to pay or for the acquisition of homes, but they can only offer pre-disaster fair market value. And because of that, one of the issues we found is that many of the homes we were buying in eastern North Carolina were low-income residences. And so if, in fact, we offered that just the federal money, which was the pre-disaster fair market value, say there's a home valued at $30,000, $40,000, even $50,000, that money often wouldn't be adequate to get them into safe and sanitary conditions outside the floodplain. So with the State Acquisition Relocation Fund, those funds allow up to $75,000 on top of the buyout offer under the federal program. So in the example of the house that's valued at $30,000, you add $75,000 of state money on top of that, and then that homeowner can often move into a safe and sanitary home located outside the floodplain.
Grant programs tend to be slow only because there has to be sufficient safeguards in the grant programs to ensure that the money is used for its intended purpose, particularly when you're dealing in billions of dollars.
That was a very difficult balance to achieve because there was a strong desire to provide the assistance as quickly as possible, and the need was certainly there. But with programs not having been previously in assistance and having to be created out of whole cloth, some thought had to be given to the structure.
If you looked at them and putting together state agencies, I worked with executive reorganization a long time ago, and it took 4 or 5 years to reorganize agencies or design or redesign programs. We were doing it in 6 to 9 months, and we expect them to be running full speed in that time frame.
How is the program going to be delivered? How is the money going to literally be conveyed? How are eligibility requirements to be established, and what are those requirements to be? What is the communications mechanism for the disaster victims? How will they be told or otherwise advised of the opportunity to seek this assistance?
And so being able to think about that early on and put strategic plans in place to make sure that recovery can occur is vitally important for the economic future of an area post-disaster.
You're talking about many of the disaster victims having no phones, no access to internet, literally living in FEMA trailers or living with relatives or living in temporary housing, the documentation that might normally be required for an application process being lost or irretrievable, and to make sure that the program wasn't set up in such a way that it could be rife for fraud and abuse of the program, and to make sure that the dollars were received by those who actually needed them. There was some delay in standing up the program to make sure that we were able to put those kinds of measures in place. And piggybacking on the existing federal programs very much enabled us to get ahead of the curve more so than had we not chosen that route to go.
FEMA wanted to give local residents a framework to help guide their rebuilding in a more sustainable fashion. It probably negatively affected the speed of recovery because in many cases, the standards were changing so drastically from what they were pre-Katrina. I think folks took some time to adjust and really to understand, why they weren't able to rebuild their home just as it was before Katrina. Now, ultimately, I think that the public policy aims have been proven out because we do have a much more sustainable coast, I think, than we had before Hurricane Katrina. But from a timing standpoint, the difficulty, I think, was that you were going from a standard that was, I think, unarguably very outdated, was not based on the most available science at the time, and then essentially trying to get it right in a short period of time caused such a drastic change in the makeup of coastal development in Mississippi that it certainly slowed recovery both from an infrastructure standpoint and from a bricks and mortar rebuilding standpoint because what was being rebuilt was so different than what was destroyed before.
When you have a disaster and you have a lot of homes flooded and damaged and so forth, don't you think that you can let things go along as usual? Those people are hurt. They won't help now. They're going to demand help now, and they're going to raise hell if you don't get it done. So you better be prepared to give the help. Don't assume that somebody else is going to do it. So it's wrong to treat people that way, and they're not going to forget it politically. I guarantee you they're going to eat you up at the next election, and they ought to. Maybe the major challenge for state is to build the state infrastructure so that you are ready to deal with a disaster effectively.
If a disaster occurs, how will you respond? How will you recover? What are the local priorities? What challenges and gaps need to be addressed? Having that plan in place takes a relatively small amount of time on the front end and can pay huge dividends on the back end.
And to the extent that the state does not have contingency plans and legal authority for the executive branch to take swift and immediate action to put in place the programs that are needed to jumpstart long-term recovery without calling in special sessions of the General Assembly, that state seriously should look at creating those programs and giving their governor the legal authority to activate them when necessary.
So my advice to you is be ready. If you know you're sitting in an area that's apt to have a major disaster, and most areas are in America now, you have to have a basic game plan that you don't have to debate the structure. You don't have to debate the personnel that are going to be involved. You don't have to debate the time frames that are going to be involved. All those are pretty well laid out, and when it comes time to do it, you activate it. I don't think many people think that way.
By not planning for disaster recovery can often lead to uncoordinated activities, programs that contradict one another, but through good pre-event planning for post-disaster recovery, you're able to harness all of the resources that those various stakeholders hold and contain and manage in order to deal with a more thoughtful, equitable recovery that also includes important risk reduction elements.
How many states have a recovery plan similar to their response plan? I would guess very few. So first of all, have a good plan. Second, work with the people that you will need to work with to implement your plan. Exercise if possible.
We have the absolute responsibility to think this thing through in advance, to figure out what our response ought to be, to set it up, to adequately fund it, and then do all we can to help our people.
One thing you learn from the mega disaster, somebody's got to be in charge.
So governors have a role to play here. It isn't just a matter of somebody putting a bill in Washington. You have to go there. You have to see the people. You work with your FEMA officials and all the others, but you have to really tell the story in the strongest personal way that you can, and then tell them what you think ought to be done.
Because you got to get decisions made. I made some bad decisions. I made a hell of a lot of decisions. And you make enough decisions, you're gonna make some bad ones. But the worst decision is no decision.
It's a body slam for a while, and what you want to do is to meet the needs to rebuild and to do it quickly so that you can limit, instead of taking 5 years to come back, you can do it in 2.5 or 3 years. By the way, that's probably as fast as you can do it in many cases. People think you can get over it all of a sudden. You're not. But you've got to be prepared. You've got to have a redevelopment commission. You've got to have enough funds. The governor's got to give it constant leadership and stay on people.
I had to lead people who did not work for me, who did not report to me, who didn't have to do what I said. And in the mega disaster, I think people understand I can't go be pig-headed and dig in. Somebody's got to be in charge, and I'm going to cooperate with the guy who's in charge as long as we're making progress. But it is a very important thing about the mega disaster, and that is you're all the time dealing with people who do not have to do what you say.
There are few times when the governor has as much opportunity to help his or her people as when you have these disasters. And it is absolutely incumbent upon us to do the very best we can to prepare for it and to lead it actively.